Listen to me carefully. What you are about to hear is not a motivational message, and it is not a comforting thought. If this video found you today, it's because something in the spiritual realm has already noticed you. This is not random, and it is not coincidence. There are moments when heaven allows a message to reach you because what is happening around you cannot be explained only by the natural. Let me be very direct. Most people read Psalm 91 as a promise, but very few understand it as a war protocol. They quote it for comfort, but they don't realize it was written for people who would face pressure, threats, and unseen resistance. Here is a question almost no one asks. Why does this psalm speak so clearly about danger, arrows, pestilence, terror at night, and destruction at noon if it was meant only to calm the heart? Why would God describe attacks in such detail unless he was preparing you to survive them? Right now, there are people watching this who have felt unexplained pressure, sudden fear, and a mental exhaustion that doesn't match their life. A heaviness that shows up without a clear reason, sleep that feels restless, thoughts that feel crowded, an inner alertness as if something is trying to get closer. And in silence, you've been asking yourself what changed, why you feel exposed, why things that never bothered you before suddenly feel heavier. This is why I need you fully present. Psalm 91 was never given to passive believers. It was given to people who would become targets, people who would walk forward while others stayed comfortable. And here is a truth most churches don't say plainly. When you move closer to purpose, you don't just attract favor, you attract resistance. Advancement always triggers opposition. Psalm 91 is not God hiding you from reality. It is God teaching you how to stand inside reality without being destroyed by it. It is not about escaping danger, it is about being preserved in the middle of it. Before this video ends, you will understand why certain attacks were blocked without you even noticing, why some things that should have broken you did not succeed, and why heaven is paying attention to you right now. Stay with me, because once you understand what Psalm 91 really activates, you will never pray it the same way again. Welcome to Psalm 91 Warfare. This is not just a YouTube channel. This is a living, active community of faith, prayer, and spiritual warfare. Right now, you are among more than 32,000 active intercessors who stand together in prayer, covering one another, families, homes, and destinies. Here, no one fights alone. This community exists for people who understand that life is not only physical, but spiritual. People who know that some battles are won on their knees before they are ever seen in the natural. Every video you watch here is part of a greater movement of agreement, where thousands are praying at the same time, declaring the same truths, and activating the same promises of God over their lives. When you stay connected to this community, you are not just listening to a message. You are entering a moment of spiritual alignment. As prayers are released, intercessors from different nations are lifting you up, even if they don't know your name. Heaven responds to unity, and there is power when believers stand together with one voice. If you want to be covered in prayer, if you want to stand in faith with others who refuse to give up, and if you want to grow stronger spiritually every day, then you belong here. Subscribe and make Psalm 91 Warfare part of your daily walk with God. This is a place of protection, authority, and perseverance. To seal this moment and take your place in this community, write this declaration in the comments. God fights my battles for me and for my family. As you do, know this: you are being prayed for, you are being covered, and you are not alone. Stay with us, stay connected, and stay under the covering of faith and prayer. Now I want you to act in faith, not later, not when the video ends, right now. If this message is speaking to you, don't stay silent. Silence never wins spiritual battles. Movement does. First, take a step of faith and subscribe to Psalm 91 Warfare. When you subscribe, you are not just joining a channel, you are entering a covering. You are aligning yourself with a community that prays, intercedes, and stands in agreement every single day. This is how you stay spiritually connected and protected. Then, like this video, that simple action is not just for the algorithm. It helps this message reach others who are under pressure, others who need protection, others who are fighting battles they haven't told anyone about. Now go to the comments and make your declaration with boldness. Don't whisper it in your heart. Write it where faith becomes visible. God fights my battles for me and for my family. As you write it, believe this: heaven responds to agreement. When thousands declare the same truth, chains break, fear loses power, and protection is activated. Finally, don't leave yet. Stay connected. Watch the next recommended video and remain under this atmosphere of prayer. The fight doesn't end here, and neither does the covering. Stand firm, stay alert, and keep walking in faith. You are not alone, and God is fighting for you. Listen carefully and stay present. This is not just the continuation of a message. This is the beginning of a confrontation. There are battles that begin in one generation and quietly move to the next, not because God allowed them, but because no one stood up to end them. What you are facing did not start with you, but it has been following you, observing patterns, waiting for moments of weakness, repeating the same cycles in different forms. And the reason this moment matters is because God does not reveal battles unless He intends to finish them. Psalm 35 and Psalm 17 were not written for casual moments. They were born out of pressure, pursuit, and injustice. They are the voice of someone who realized that the fight was no longer just external. It had become spiritual, strategic, and deeply personal. David understood something most people miss. When attacks keep repeating without explanation, when opposition appears even when you walk uprightly, when your family line carries the same struggles in different generations, you are not dealing with coincidence. You are dealing with a generational resistance that must be confronted with authority. There are people listening right now who have done nothing wrong, yet they feel constantly opposed. You try to move forward and something pushes back. You try to rest and your mind stays alert. You try to build and something collapses unexpectedly. This is not because you are weak. In many cases, it is because you are the one chosen to break what others tolerated. And when that happens, the pressure increases before it breaks. Psalm 35 opens with a bold request. Contend, Lord, with those who contend with me. Fight against those who fight against me. That is not fear speaking. That is alignment. David was not asking God to hide him. He was asking God to step into the battlefield and take over the fight. This is the posture of someone who understands spiritual authority. When God fights, the enemy does not negotiate. When God rises, patterns collapse. Psalm 17 complements this by revealing the inner examination. You have tested my heart. You have examined me at night. This matters because generational attacks often try to disguise themselves as personal failure. They whisper accusations. They try to convince you that the problem is you. But God examines before He defends. He confirms integrity before He releases judgment. This is why these two psalms together are powerful. One calls God into the battle. The other confirms you are not the source of the problem. There are inherited battles that operate like shadows. They follow quietly. They do not always attack loudly. Sometimes they work through delay, sometimes through confusion, sometimes through repeated disappointment. The enemy hopes you normalize what God wants you to confront, but today that pattern is being exposed. As we move through this warfare declaration 7 times, understand this clearly. Repetition in Scripture is not ritual, it is reinforcement. 7 represents completion. When something is declared 7 times in faith, it is not begging, it is closing a cycle. What followed your family line stops when someone with discernment and faith stands up and says, "No further." If you feel a stirring inside you right now, that is not emotion. That is recognition. Your spirit recognizes this moment. You were not brought here to be informed, but to be positioned. The reason the attack intensified before now is because the end of the cycle is near. Resistance always increases before collapse. God does not expose generational battles to scare you. He exposes them to end them. And He does not send you into a fight without standing in front of you. Psalm 35 makes that clear. Psalm 17 seals it. The enemy may have studied your bloodline, but God authored your destiny. And destiny outranks inheritance. Before we go further, take a step of agreement and faith. Write this in the comments now. God fights for me, and this cycle ends here. This is not for visibility. It is alignment. When you speak, heaven responds. Stay with me. We are just beginning. The next block will take us deeper into how these attacks operate and why they lose their power when confronted with truth. Stay focused, because what we are about to address now goes deeper. Many people can identify that something is wrong, but very few understand how generational attacks actually operate. The enemy's greatest advantage has never been power. It has always been familiarity. He studies patterns. He observes family lines. He looks for repeated weaknesses, repeated doors, repeated wounds that were never healed or confronted. And when he finds them, he exploits them quietly, generation after generation. This is why Psalm 35 is so confrontational. David does not pray politely. He does not minimize the threat. He names it. He exposes it. He calls it out directly. Contend with those who contend with me. That word, contend, implies a legal dispute, a case brought before a higher authority. David understood that spiritual warfare is not chaos. It is order. It is about jurisdiction. Whoever has legal ground has access. Whoever loses ground loses influence. Generational attacks often begin with unaddressed trauma, injustice, sin, or spiritual compromise somewhere in the family line. Over time, they stop looking like spiritual issues and start looking like normal life. Patterns of broken relationships, patterns of financial instability, patterns of fear, anger, addiction, sickness, or early death. The danger is not the pattern itself. The danger is when people accept the pattern as identity. Psalm 17 addresses this directly when David says, "My steps have held fast to your paths. My feet have not slipped." This is critical. David separates his walk from the attack. He refuses to internalize the accusation. Generational warfare always tries to confuse the two. It wants you to believe that what is happening to you is because of who you are, not because of what is following you. But God does not confuse the innocent with the guilty. He examines before He judges. There are people listening right now who have spent years trying to fix themselves, improve themselves, correct themselves, when the real issue was never personal failure. It was inherited resistance. And the enemy was happy to let you stay exhausted, thinking the problem was you, as long as you never confronted him. But that season ends when truth enters. Psalm 35 reveals something else that is important. The enemy often attacks without cause. David says, "They hid their net for me without cause." This is a clear sign of generational warfare. When attacks have no clear origin, when hostility feels disproportionate, when opposition appears even when you're doing right, that is not coincidence. That is spiritual hostility reacting to calling. Generational attacks intensify when someone in the family line begins to walk differently. When you choose integrity, prayer, obedience, and spiritual awareness, you disrupt patterns. And disruption provokes reaction. The enemy does not want the cycle broken. He wants it normalized, ignored, or blamed on personality. But Psalm 35 gives language to confront unjust pursuit, and Psalm 17 gives confidence to stand clean before God while doing it. Understand this clearly. Breaking generational attacks does not require you to know every detail of your family history. It requires you to stand in agreement with God's authority over it. David did not trace every enemy's origin. He brought the case to God. When heaven takes the case, outcomes change. This is why the 7 times declaration matters. Each repetition is not a plea. It is a strike against the same root. You are not addressing 7 different problems. You are confronting one system repeatedly until it collapses. Patterns fall when authority is consistently applied. Some people fear confronting generational issues because they think it will open doors. The opposite is true. Ignoring them leaves doors open. Exposure closes doors, light ends shadows, and Psalm 35 and 17 are psalms of light. They expose the unseen, the hidden, the unfair, and the inherited, and they hand them over to God's justice. As we continue, I want you to remember this. You are not late. You are not weak. You are not behind. You are positioned. God does not assign cycle breakers randomly. He assigns them to those who can withstand pressure without losing faith. The very fact that you are here means you were trusted with this moment. Take another step of agreement now. Write this declaration in the comments. I will not carry what was never meant to follow me. This is not defiance. It is alignment with truth. Remain steady as we go deeper, because one of the most exhausting forms of generational warfare is not sudden attack, but repeated delay. There are people who are not destroyed, but constantly postponed. You move forward, but something slows you down. You make progress, but it feels like it never fully manifests. Doors seem close to opening, then stall. Opportunities appear, then dissolve. Over time, this creates quiet frustration and spiritual fatigue. And if not discerned, delay can do what fear could not, convince you to lower your expectations. Psalm 35 addresses this kind of warfare directly. David speaks of enemies who rewarded me evil for good and dug pits for my soul. This language reveals strategy, not chaos. Pits are not meant to attack openly. They are meant to trap, delay, and immobilize. Generational attacks often operate this way. They are designed to keep you busy, surviving instead of advancing, tired instead of fulfilled, faithful but discouraged. The enemy does not always need to destroy a person if he can keep them waiting indefinitely. Psalm 17 brings clarity to this by grounding the soul. David declares that his steps have held firm, that his mouth has not transgressed, that his heart has been tested. This matters because delay tries to accuse you internally. It whispers that if God truly intended to move, he would have done it already. It tempts you to question your obedience, your worth, or your timing. But God's examination is not for condemnation. It is for confirmation. Delay does not mean denial, and silence does not mean absence. Generational delay often masquerades as patience. While patience is a fruit of the Spirit, forced waiting caused by spiritual resistance is not the same. The danger is when people spiritualize what God wants them to confront. David did not say, "I will simply wait and accept this." He prayed. He called on God to act. He refused to normalize obstruction. This is critical. What you tolerate quietly can become a pattern loudly. There are families where advancement always seems one step away. Someone is always almost there, almost healed, almost stable, almost prosperous, almost at peace. That almost can span generations. But Psalm 35 does not accept proximity as success. It calls for completion. It calls for resolution. And Psalm 17 reinforces that call by anchoring the believer in righteousness and trust, not resignation. Another tactic of generational delay is distraction. The enemy introduces minor battles to keep you from winning the major one. Emotional conflicts, relational strain, endless small fires that drain your focus. By the time you lift your head, years have passed. Psalm 17's prayer for focus, "Let my steps be firm," is a request for clarity. When your steps are firm, distraction loses its grip. When your direction is clear, delay becomes visible for what it is. It is important to understand that God does not rush, but neither does he stall. When something repeatedly blocks movement without explanation, it is often spiritual resistance, not divine timing. Discernment is knowing the difference. Psalm 35 teaches you how to invite God into the obstruction itself, not just into the outcome. When God confronts what is slowing you down, acceleration follows naturally. Some people fear confronting delay because they worry they are being impatient. But David's prayers were not impatient, they were aligned. He knew God's character, he knew God is just. He knew God defends the upright. He also knew that prolonged injustice is not a virtue. Waiting becomes dangerous when it dulls expectancy. God wants faith active, not dormant. As this resonates with you, take a moment to reflect on where delay has shown up in your life or family. It might be financial, emotional, relational, or spiritual. You do not need to analyze it deeply right now. Simply acknowledge it, and if you feel led, write a brief prayer request in the comments naming that area. Even a word like delay, finances, peace, or direction is enough. When you name it, you invite prayer into it, and agreement weakens resistance. Psalm 35 also reveals that God does not ignore prolonged battles. David speaks with confidence that joy will return, that shame will be reversed, that those who oppose will lose their ground. This is not wishful thinking. It is covenant language. Delay does not cancel promise. It only highlights the moment when God intervenes. Psalm 17 closes with a powerful expectation. As for me, I will behold your face in righteousness. When I awake, I shall be satisfied. This is not about sleep. It is about awakening to fulfillment. Satisfaction is the opposite of delay. It is completion. It is arrival. It is peace after movement. David expected not just survival, but fulfillment. Generational delay breaks when someone refuses to accept almost as the final answer. When you stand in prayer, clarity, and agreement, you shift the timeline, not by force, but by alignment. God accelerates what resistance tried to slow. What followed your family line does not control your future. If you feel that this speaks directly to your situation, place your prayer request in the comments now. This community stands in agreement for movement, clarity, and breakthrough. What is brought into prayer does not remain stagnant. It begins to move. Hold this truth firmly. Delay is not your identity. Waiting is not your destiny. God's justice moves with purpose, and when it moves, it completes what resistance tried to interrupt. Remain attentive, because another common layer of generational warfare is repetition. Not just delay, but the feeling that the same type of battle keeps returning in different forms. You change environments, you mature, you pray, you grow, yet the same resistance shows up again. Different faces, different seasons, but the same pressure. Over time, this repetition can quietly wear down hope, making you wonder if progress is even possible. Psalm 35 exposes this pattern clearly. David speaks of enemies who repay evil for good and gather against me when I was unaware. This reveals something important. Repetition does not always come from your actions. Sometimes it comes from a system that learned your family line. Generational attacks repeat because they were never fully confronted. They adapt, but they do not innovate. The enemy reuses what once worked, hoping it will keep working. Psalm 17 addresses the internal danger of repetition, discouragement. When the same kind of battle keeps resurfacing, the mind starts building conclusions. This always happens. Nothing ever changes. Why try again? These thoughts feel logical, but they are not truth. They are fatigue talking. And fatigue is one of the enemy's favorite tools because tired people stop resisting with authority. David's response is instructive. He does not ignore repetition, and he does not internalize it. He brings it before God. He allows God to examine his heart, not to condemn him, but to remind him of alignment. Repetition tries to confuse cause and effect. It tries to make you believe that because something keeps happening, you must be the reason. But God separates the pattern from the person. Many families experience repeating themes: constant conflict, recurring financial instability, cycles of broken trust, patterns of abandonment, or ongoing health struggles. Over time, these patterns become normal. Children grow up expecting them. Adults adjust their expectations around them, but what is familiar is not always acceptable. Psalm 35 does not treat repetition as normal. It treats it as opposition. Another subtle danger of repetition is emotional numbness. After facing the same battle enough times, people stop reacting. They stop praying with expectation. They stop asking boldly. They pray defensively instead of authoritatively. Psalm 17 pushes against this by restoring perspective. David reminds himself that God sees, God hears, and God acts. Repetition does not dull God's awareness, even if it dulls human emotion. This is why the 7 times declaration matters so deeply. Repetition created the pattern, but repetition in faith dismantles it. Each declaration is not redundant. It is targeted. You are not repeating words. You are applying pressure consistently until resistance collapses. What resists once may resist twice. What resists repeatedly eventually breaks when authority remains steady. There is also a spiritual lie hidden in repetition, that endurance alone is the goal. Endurance matters, but endurance without breakthrough leads to resignation. God does not only call his people to endure cycles, he calls them to end them. David endured, yes, but he also confronted, prayed, declared, and expected change. Psalm 35 shows us that God responds to unjust repetition. David asks God to intervene publicly, to reverse shame, to expose those who operate in hidden ways. This matters because repetition often thrives in secrecy. When no one talks about it, when no one prays specifically about it, when it remains unnamed, it stays powerful. Exposure weakens repetition. Psalm 17 reinforces this by anchoring identity. David does not allow repetition to redefine who he is. He grounds himself in God's righteousness and presence. This protects the heart from bitterness. Bitterness is another way repetition wins quietly. It convinces you that resistance is permanent and hope is naive. But faith remains active when identity remains intact. If you recognize a repeating pattern in your life or family, this is not a moment for shame. It is a moment for clarity. Awareness is the beginning of authority, and you do not need to confront it alone. If you feel led, write a short prayer request in the comments describing the pattern you are tired of seeing. Repeat. You do not need to explain everything. When you name it, you allow this community to stand with you in prayer and agreement. God does not shame people for noticing patterns. He empowers them to end them. Repetition is not proof of defeat. It is proof that the same strategy is being used because something deeper has not yet been addressed. And when something deeper is addressed, repetition loses its grip. Psalm 17's confidence is not emotional, it is relational. David trusts God's justice because he knows God's character. This trust fuels persistence without despair. You can pray repeatedly without losing hope when you know who you are praying to. God does not get tired of hearing the same cry when it is rooted in truth. As these truths settle in, remember this: what has repeated is not eternal. Patterns are not promises. Cycles are not covenants. God's word has greater authority than history, and his intention outweighs inheritance. When repetition meets revelation, change begins. If repetition has been part of your story, do not stay silent. Place your prayer request in the comments and let agreement surround it. What is confronted in prayer does not continue unchecked. What is lifted into the light begins to lose its hold. Hold on to this assurance. Repetition is being challenged, authority is being applied, and what once returned again and again is losing its permission to stay. Remain grounded as we move forward, because another layer of generational warfare that often goes unnoticed is exhaustion. Not physical tiredness alone, but a deep weariness of the soul. This is the kind of fatigue that comes from fighting the same battles internally for too long without visible resolution. You are still functioning, still believing, still praying, but something inside feels worn down. And that weariness is not random. Psalm 35 reveals that prolonged opposition drains strength when it is not confronted with clarity. David speaks of sorrow for his soul, of anguish caused by those who pursue him unjustly. This tells us something important. Spiritual battles are not only about attack, they are about endurance. The enemy understands that if he cannot overpower you, he can try to exhaust you. Tired people are easier to discourage. Weary people lower their guard. Exhaustion is not defeat, but it can become a gateway if left unaddressed. Psalm 17 brings a different tone. David asks God to hear his plea, to give ear to his prayer that does not come from deceitful lips. This is the prayer of someone who is tired but still honest, worn but still aligned. Generational exhaustion often develops when people feel they must be strong without being supported. They carry burdens silently. They feel responsible for holding everything together. Over time, this creates isolation, and isolation feeds weariness. There are families where exhaustion becomes inherited. Parents are tired, children grow up tired, dreams are postponed not because of lack of ability, but because of lack of energy. People learn to survive instead of expect. They learn to manage stress instead of confront it. But God does not design his people to live depleted. Weariness is a signal, not a sentence. Psalm 35 shows that David did not hide his exhaustion from God. He spoke it. He named it. He did not pretend he was unaffected. This matters because pretending strength does not produce strength. Honest prayer does. When you acknowledge weariness before God, you are not confessing weakness. You are inviting renewal. Psalm 17 reinforces this by grounding rest in relationship. David trusts that God examines him, sees him, and keeps him as the apple of his eye. This identity restores strength. Many people feel tired not because they are doing too much, but because they feel unseen. When you feel unseen, effort feels heavier. But when you know you are seen, endurance is renewed. Generational exhaustion often comes from carrying battles that were never yours to carry. Emotional burdens passed down, expectations inherited, responsibilities assumed too early. Over time, the soul learns to stay tense, always alert, always bracing for impact. This is not peace. This is survival mode, and Psalm 17's prayer for protection under God's wings is an invitation out of survival and into security. It is important to understand that rest is not avoidance. Biblical rest is restoration. It is not disengaging from the fight. It is being strengthened for it. David did not stop confronting his enemies. He rested in God while confronting them. This balance is key. Without it, people burn out spiritually even while doing the right things. Psalm 35 also reminds us that God is attentive to prolonged suffering. David speaks with confidence that God will not be silent forever. Silence can feel like abandonment when exhaustion is high. But silence is often preparation. God strengthens internally before he moves externally. What feels like waiting is often fortifying. If you feel tired in a way that prayer alone has not seemed to fix, this does not mean your faith is weak. It may mean you have been carrying too much alone. This is why community matters. This is why shared prayer matters. When burden is shared, strength multiplies. If exhaustion has been part of your story, emotional, mental, or spiritual, Take a moment now and place a short prayer request in the comments. You do not need to explain everything. Even a simple word like strength, rest, or renewal is enough. When you do, you are allowing others to stand with you, and agreement releases relief. Psalm 17 ends with expectation, not depletion. David anticipates satisfaction, not survival. This is important. God's goal is not to keep you barely standing. His goal is to restore joy, clarity, and strength. Weariness is not the end of your story. It is a signal that restoration is needed and coming. Generational exhaustion breaks when someone chooses to stop carrying what was never assigned to them. When you release inherited pressure and receive divine strength, the cycle weakens. God replenishes what resistance tried to drain. As you sit with this truth, remember, you are allowed to rest without losing authority. You are allowed to ask for help without losing faith. You are allowed to be renewed without guilt. God sustains those He calls, and He restores those who have been worn down by long battles. If this resonates with you, do not keep it inside. Place your prayer request in the comments and let this community stand with you. What is shared in prayer does not remain heavy. It begins to lift. Hold on to this assurance. Strength is being renewed, weariness is being addressed, and what tried to exhaust you is losing its influence. Stay centered as we continue, because another hidden layer of generational warfare is confusion. Not loud confusion, but subtle disorientation. The kind that makes you question your decisions, doubt your discernment, and hesitate even when you're doing the right thing. Confusion blurs direction. It drains confidence. And over time, it can keep people circling the same ground instead of moving forward. Psalm 35 exposes how confusion is used strategically. David speaks of enemies who plot deceit and speak peace with their mouths, but devise deceit in their hearts. This reveals a tactic: distortion. When truth is distorted long enough, clarity weakens. Generational confusion often enters through mixed messages, inconsistent guidance, and environments where reality is constantly questioned. Children grow up learning to doubt what they see and feel. Adults learn to second-guess themselves, even when they are aligned with God. Psalm 17 brings stability into this fog. David asks God to hear his prayer and to keep him as the apple of his eye. This is grounding language. When God's gaze becomes your reference point, confusion loses its authority. Many people feel confused not because they lack wisdom, but because too many voices have been allowed to shape their decisions. Confusion multiplies when discernment is crowded. Generational confusion often disguises itself as humility. People say, "I'm not sure, I don't want to assume, I could be wrong," even when truth is evident. While humility is valuable, chronic uncertainty is not spiritual maturity. It is often a learned survival strategy. When environments are unpredictable, people learn to stay mentally flexible to avoid conflict. Over time, that flexibility becomes indecision. Psalm 35 confronts this by calling for exposure. David does not allow hidden agendas to operate unchallenged. He asks God to reveal, to intervene, to bring clarity through justice. Confusion thrives where things remain undefined. Clarity returns when truth is named. God is not the author of confusion, and anything that consistently clouds your discernment does not come from Him. Psalm 17 also highlights examination. God tests the heart, not to confuse it, but to confirm it. This is important. Confusion often tells you that you cannot trust yourself. God's examination tells you that alignment is possible and real. When you know God sees your heart, you do not need to constantly prove yourself. This steadies the mind. There are families where confusion becomes inherited. Decisions are delayed. Conversations go unresolved. Boundaries remain unclear. Over time, people adapt by staying vague. But vagueness weakens authority. Psalm 35 shows that clarity is not aggressive, it is righteous. David is clear about who is opposing him and clear about who God is. This clarity creates momentum. Another way confusion operates is through emotional overload. When emotions pile up without resolution, the mind struggles to process direction. Psalm 17's request for protection under God's wings is also a request for mental peace. Protection is not only physical, it is cognitive. When your mind is guarded, confusion loses access. Confusion also feeds procrastination. When people are unsure, they wait, they hesitate. They delay action not because they are lazy, but because they fear making the wrong move. Over time, this delay can look like obedience, but it is actually paralysis. Psalm 35 breaks this paralysis by inviting God into decision-making. When God contends for you, movement resumes. If confusion has been present in your life about direction, relationships, calling, or next steps, this is not something to ignore. Confusion is not neutral. It drains energy and steals time. But it can be confronted gently through prayer and agreement. You do not need to force clarity. You need to invite God's order. As this speaks to you, take a moment to place a prayer request in the comments related to clarity or direction. You do not need to explain everything. Even words like clarity, decision, or guidance are enough. When you name confusion, you invite peace. And when many pray together, discernment sharpens. Psalm 17 ends with satisfaction, not confusion. Satisfaction implies understanding, resolution, and peace. God does not intend for his people to live constantly unsure. He guides, he leads, he confirms. Confusion may have followed your family line, but it does not have authority over your future. Psalm 35 reinforces that God is active, not distant. He sees deception, he confronts distortion, he restores order. When God enters the picture, confusion cannot maintain its grip. Light reorganizes what darkness scrambled. As you continue listening and praying, remember this: clarity is not something you earn through stress. It is something you receive through alignment. When your heart is anchored and your prayers are honest, direction becomes clearer. Confusion fades, not because answers suddenly appear, but because peace settles in. If confusion has weighed on you, do not carry it alone. Place your prayer request in the comments and allow this community to stand with you. What is shared in prayer does not remain tangled. It begins to straighten. Hold on to this truth. Order is being restored. Discernment is sharpening, and what once kept you uncertain is losing its influence. Remain attentive, because another layer of generational warfare that often hides beneath the surface is guilt. Not healthy conviction, but inherited guilt. The kind that makes you feel responsible for things you did not cause, accountable for outcomes you did not choose, and ashamed without a clear reason. This kind of guilt keeps people apologizing for existing, shrinking their expectations, and carrying emotional weight that was never assigned to them. Psalm 35 confronts false guilt by exposing injustice. David speaks as someone who has been accused without cause, opposed without reason, and repaid evil for good. This matters because unjust accusation is a common weapon in generational battles. When guilt is passed down, people learn to assume blame before understanding truth. They over-explain. They overcompensate. They carry responsibility for broken systems they did not create. Over time, this erodes confidence and distorts identity. Psalm 17 provides the corrective lens. David invites God to examine him, not because he fears exposure, but because he trusts God's judgment. This is crucial. False guilt thrives when people fear being seen. True integrity thrives when people welcome examination. God's examination does not crush, it clarifies. When God examines, he separates what belongs to you from what does not. There are family lines where guilt becomes a default posture. Children grow up feeling like a burden. Adults feel guilty for resting, succeeding, or setting boundaries. Saying no feels wrong. Asking for help feels selfish. This is not humility, it is inherited distortion. Psalm 35 does not accept distorted narratives. David calls on God to defend his innocence publicly. He asks for vindication, not validation. Vindication restores truth. Another way guilt operates is through misplaced responsibility. People feel responsible for keeping peace at any cost, fixing everyone's problems, or holding families together. When things fall apart, they internalize the failure. Over time, this creates a savior complex rooted in guilt, not love. Psalm 17's prayer for protection under God's wings is a release from that burden. Protection implies coverage. Coverage implies that not everything rests on you. Guilt also weakens prayer. People pray cautiously when they feel unworthy. They soften their requests. They lower their expectations. They ask indirectly instead of boldly. But Psalm 35 is not a timid prayer. It is confident, direct, and grounded in relationship. David does not approach God as someone begging for mercy he doesn't deserve. He approaches as someone aligned with covenant. Psalm 17 reinforces this alignment by anchoring identity. David knows who he is before God. This is what breaks false guilt. When you know where you stand, accusations lose power. The enemy often uses guilt to keep people silent. Silent people do not confront. Silent people do not ask. Silent people do not challenge patterns. Guilt thrives in silence. There are people listening who feel guilty for things that happened long before they were born. They feel pressure to fix generational pain, to redeem family stories, to carry emotional debts that are not theirs. Compassion is good. Responsibility for inherited wounds is not. You can honor your family without carrying their guilt. God does not ask you to pay for what he already covered. Psalm 35 shows that God takes accusations seriously. He does not dismiss them lightly, but he also does not allow them to stand unchallenged. When you bring false guilt before God, he addresses it. When you name it, he separates it. Truth dismantles shame. Psalm 17's confidence reminds us that righteousness is not self-produced. It is received through relationship. You do not need to prove your worth through endless effort. You are already seen, examined, and known by God. This awareness releases the soul from constant self-judgment. If guilt has followed you, guilt you cannot explain, guilt that feels heavier than the situation calls for, this is a moment to bring it into the light. You do not need to carry it quietly. If you feel comfortable, place a brief prayer request in the comments related to guilt, shame, or emotional weight. You do not need to give details. Naming it allows prayer to meet it, and agreement weakens its hold. Generational guilt breaks when someone chooses truth over assumption. When you stop apologizing for being present, for resting, for advancing, for setting boundaries, you interrupt a long-standing pattern. God does not advance people who live under false condemnation. He frees them first. Psalm 35's call for justice and Psalm 17's call for protection work together here. Justice removes false charges. Protection restores peace. Together they dismantle guilt at the root. What once made you feel small begins to lose its authority. As this truth settles, remember, guilt is not a virtue. Shame is not humility. Responsibility is not ownership of everything. God invites you to walk upright, not burdened. He corrects where needed, but he does not crush. If this resonates with you, do not keep it internal. Place your prayer request in the comments and allow this community to stand with you. What is shared in prayer is no longer carried alone. It begins to lift. Hold on to this assurance. False guilt is being confronted, identity is being restored, and what once weighed you down is losing its power to define you. Remain present, because another deep layer of generational warfare is silence. Not the healthy silence of peace, but inherited silence, the kind that teaches people not to speak, not to confront, not to name what hurts. Silence can look like strength on the outside, but inside it allows patterns to survive unchallenged. What is never spoken is rarely healed. Psalm 35 confronts silence head-on. David refuses to suffer quietly. He refuses to keep injustice internal. He speaks clearly about what is happening, who is responsible, and what he is asking God to do. This matters because generational attacks often depend on silence to remain effective. When families avoid difficult conversations, spiritual issues are buried instead of resolved. Over time, silence becomes tradition. Psalm 17 balances this by showing how to speak without losing integrity. David does not rant, he does not explode emotionally. He brings his case before God with honesty and clarity. This teaches us something powerful. Breaking silence does not mean becoming aggressive. It means becoming truthful. Truth spoken in alignment has authority. There are families where silence is mistaken for loyalty. You don't question, you don't expose. You don't bring certain things into the light. Children learn early what topics are off limits. Adults learn to manage discomfort instead of address it. Over time, this silence creates internal pressure. Things go unresolved, emotions go unprocessed, and spiritual patterns go unchecked. Psalm 35 shows that God does not partner with silence when silence protects injustice. David asks God to act publicly, to expose hidden agendas, to confront what operates in secret. This is important because generational warfare often hides behind the phrase, "That's just how it is." Silence reinforces that lie. Speaking truth interrupts it. Psalm 17 also reveals that God listens closely when people speak honestly. David trusts that God hears his voice, not just his thoughts. This matters. Silent prayers can still be prayers, but spoken prayer carries a different weight. When you speak, you externalize what has been internalized. You break agreement with silence. Silence also affects prayer life. People who grow up in silent environments often struggle to pray boldly. They soften their words. They minimize their needs. They pray indirectly. But Psalm 35 is direct. It names enemies, it names injustice, it names expectation. God is not intimidated by honesty, he responds to it. Another danger of silence is emotional isolation. When people do not share what they are facing, they assume no one else will understand. This isolates them even in community. Generational silence teaches people to carry burdens alone. But God designed healing to happen in relationship, not isolation. Psalm 17's imagery of being kept as the apple of God's eye speaks directly to this. You are seen, you are known, you are not meant to disappear emotionally. God does not overlook quiet suffering, he invites it forward. Silence ends when safety is established, and God provides that safety. Breaking silence does not mean exposing everything to everyone. It means choosing not to hide everything from God and his people. It means allowing prayer to touch what silence protected. When silence is broken in a healthy way, relief follows. Pressure eases. Patterns lose strength. There are people listening who have never spoken certain prayer needs out loud. Not because they lack faith, but because silence was learned early. But this moment is different. You are not being asked to explain your story. You are being invited to step out of silence and into agreement. Psalm 35 reminds us that when truth is spoken, God moves. Psalm 17 reminds us that when hearts are honest, God protects. Together, they dismantle the power of silence. What once stayed hidden begins to surface. What surfaces can be healed. As this resonates with you, take a step that gently breaks silence. Instead of explaining, simply type a word or short phrase in the comments that represents what you want prayer for. It could be family or peace and strength, clarity or freedom. You don't need details. That single word is enough to open the door for prayer and agreement. Silence loses power when truth is invited in. And when many people pray together, what was once heavy begins to lift. You are not interrupting anything by speaking. You are aligning with healing. Remember this, Silence is not protection. God is. And God responds when his people speak with honesty and trust. What remained hidden is now being addressed, not with judgment but with care. If you feel led, place that word in the comments now and allow this community to stand with you in prayer. What you bring into the light does not stay buried. It begins to change. Hold on to this assurance. Silence is breaking, support is surrounding you, and what once survived in the dark is losing its place in your life. Remain attentive, because another powerful layer of generational warfare operates through expectation. Not positive expectation, but inherited limitation. The quiet belief that life will only go so far, that certain outcomes are unrealistic, and that disappointment is safer than hope. This kind of expectation does not shout, it settles. And once it settles, it quietly governs decisions, prayers, and faith. Psalm 35 confronts this limitation by refusing to accept a small outcome. David does not pray for survival alone. He prays for vindication, restoration, and public reversal. He expects God to act decisively. This matters because generational limitation trains people to pray cautiously. They ask God to help them cope, not to intervene. They ask for strength to endure, not justice to resolve. Over time, faith becomes defensive instead of expectant. Psalm 17 restores rightful expectation by grounding it in relationship. David is confident because he knows who God is, not because circumstances look favorable. He expects God to hear, to see, and to protect. This kind of expectation is dangerous to generational patterns because it refuses to be shaped by past outcomes. It looks forward based on covenant, not history. There are families where hope has been slowly lowered over time. Dreams are adjusted downward. Goals are softened. People learn not to expect too much because disappointment feels worse than resignation. This is not wisdom, it is learned protection. But Psalm 35 does not protect itself from disappointment by lowering expectation. It protects itself by placing expectation in God. Generational warfare often works by teaching people what not to expect. Don't expect stability. Don't expect peace. Don't expect lasting change. These beliefs are rarely spoken, but they are deeply felt. They shape how people pray. They shape what people ask for. Psalm 17 challenges this by affirming that God satisfies those who seek him. Satisfaction implies fulfillment, not mere endurance. Another danger of limited expectation is delayed obedience. When people do not expect meaningful change, they hesitate to step forward. Why try if the outcome feels predetermined? This hesitation keeps cycles intact. Psalm 35 breaks this by assuming movement. David prays as someone who expects God to act, not eventually, but decisively. Expectation fuels momentum. Expectation also affects identity. People who expect little often minimize themselves. They downplay gifts. They avoid visibility. They settle into roles that feel safe but unfulfilling. This can pass from one generation to the next, becoming a family culture of smallness. But Psalm 17 reminds us that being kept as the apple of God's eye implies value, intention, and care. God does not guard what he does not intend to use. Limited expectation also weakens prayer language. People pray in generalities instead of specifics. They ask vaguely instead of boldly. This is not humility, it is hesitation. Psalm 35's specificity teaches us that clear prayers invite clear answers. David names what he wants reversed. He names what he wants restored. He names the outcome he trusts God to bring. It's important to understand that expectation does not control God. It aligns you with what God already desires to do. When expectation is low, alignment weakens. When expectation rises, alignment strengthens. God's ability does not change, but your readiness to receive does. Psalm 17's confidence shows readiness rooted in trust, not entitlement. There are people listening who stopped expecting change a long time ago. Not because they stopped believing in God, but because they stopped believing change was possible for them. This resignation feels mature, but it quietly feeds despair. God does not call his people to live without expectation. He calls them to anchor expectation in him. Psalm 35 shows that God responds to bold expectation with action. Psalm 17 shows that God honors trust with protection. Together, they dismantle inherited limitation. What your family line learned to expect does not define what God intends to deliver. As this speaks to you, take a moment to notice where your expectations may have been lowered over time. You do not need to judge yourself for it. Awareness is enough, and if you feel led, place a short note in the comments describing what you are believing God to restore or shift. It can be as simple as hope, direction, peace, or breakthrough. When you express it, you invite agreement. And agreement strengthens expectation. Expectation grows when it is shared. Faith sharpens when it is spoken. You are not tempting disappointment by hoping again. You are positioning yourself for alignment. God is not threatened by your expectation. He responds to it. Psalm 17 ends with satisfaction because expectation was not abandoned. Psalm 35 ends with praise because justice was anticipated. These psalms teach us that expectation is not naive, it is necessary. Without it, cycles persist. With it, patterns break. Do not underestimate what can shift when expectation is restored. What once felt unreachable begins to feel possible. What once felt distant begins to draw near. This is not emotional optimism. It is spiritual alignment. If expectation has been damaged in your life, do not keep that private. Place a word or phrase in the comments that represents what you are believing for now. This is not about explanation, it is about agreement. When many stand together in faith, expectation rises and resistance weakens. Hold on to this truth. Expectation is being renewed, faith is being strengthened, and what once trained you to expect less is losing its influence. Remain attentive, because another deeply rooted layer of generational warfare operates through identity distortion. Not outright lies, but subtle mislabeling. The quiet shaping of how you see yourself based on what has happened around you instead of what God has spoken over you. Identity distortion convinces people to live beneath their calling while believing they are being realistic. Psalm 35 confronts this by refusing to accept the labels placed on David by his enemies. He is treated as guilty when he is innocent, hunted when he is faithful, opposed when he seeks peace. Yet David does not internalize those labels. He brings the distortion before God. This is critical. Identity warfare intensifies when people begin to agree with what opposition says about them. Psalm 17 restores identity by grounding it in God's examination rather than human opinion. David trusts that God sees his heart clearly. This matters because identity confusion often comes from mixed feedback. One generation criticizes, another withholds affirmation, another normalizes struggle. Over time, people learn to define themselves by survival instead of purpose. There are family lines where identity becomes tied to hardship. We're just fighters. We always struggle. Nothing comes easy for us. These statements feel honest, but they quietly limit identity. They reduce people to patterns instead of promise. Psalm 35 refuses to let suffering define identity. David expects God to vindicate him publicly, which restores truth about who he is. Identity distortion also affects spiritual authority. People who see themselves as perpetual victims struggle to pray with confidence. They pray cautiously, expecting resistance. But Psalm 17's posture is confident without arrogance. David knows who he is before God, and that clarity gives his prayer weight. Authority flows from identity alignment. Another danger of distorted identity is self-sabotage. When people unconsciously believe they are not meant to advance, they hesitate when opportunity appears. They second-guess success. They feel uncomfortable with peace. This is not humility, it is inherited misalignment. Psalm 35 shows that God is not uncomfortable restoring honor. He delights in it. Generational identity distortion often passes quietly. No one explicitly teaches it. It is absorbed through observation. Children learn who they are allowed to be by watching what is celebrated and what is criticized. Over time, calling shrinks to fit family expectation. But Psalm 17 reminds us that God's eye defines value, not environment. Identity is also tied to boundaries. People with distorted identity struggle to say no. They feel guilty for protecting their time, energy, or peace. They confuse availability with worth. Psalm 35 disrupts this by showing that God sets boundaries through justice. When God intervenes, he draws lines that others cannot cross. Psalm 17's request to be kept under God's wings is not escapism. It is recentering. It is choosing God's perspective over inherited narratives. When you see yourself as God sees you, you stop negotiating with labels that do not belong to you. There are people listening who have lived responsibly, faithfully, and quietly, yet still feel unsure of who they are allowed to become. They feel a tension between desire and permission. That tension is often the result of identity distortion, not lack of calling. God does not give desire without intention. Identity distortion also affects how people handle correction. When identity is fragile, correction feels like rejection. But when identity is anchored, correction becomes refinement. Psalm 17 shows this maturity. David invites examination because he knows his foundation is secure. Secure identity welcomes growth without fear. Psalm 35 reinforces that God defends identity actively. He does not leave his people misrepresented indefinitely. Vindication may take time, but it is intentional. God restores truth, not just comfort. When truth is restored, identity stabilizes. As this speaks to you, consider where identity may have been shaped more by history than by God's word. You do not need to resolve it all now. Awareness is the first step. And if you feel led, place a word or short phrase in the comments that reflects an area where you want God to restore clarity in who you are, such as purpose, confidence, calling, or peace. When you name it, you invite prayer and alignment around it. Identity is not something you have to create. It is something you receive. And when you receive it, authority follows naturally. You stop striving to prove yourself and start standing in who God says you are. Psalm 17 ends with satisfaction because identity was settled. Psalm 35 ends with praise because justice restored honor. These outcomes are connected. When identity is healed, praise becomes natural, not forced. Do not underestimate how much can shift when identity aligns with truth. Decisions become clearer. Boundaries strengthen. Peace deepens. What once confused you begins to make sense. If identity has felt unclear or diminished in your life, do not carry that silently. Place your word or phrase in the comments and allow this community to stand with you in prayer. Agreement reinforces truth, and truth restores identity. Hold on to this assurance. Identity is being clarified, mislabeling is losing power, and what once defined you by struggle is giving way to purpose and peace. Remain attentive, because another layer of generational warfare that often goes unnoticed is unresolved grief. Not grief that is acknowledged and healed, but grief that is buried, postponed, or normalized. This kind of grief does not disappear with time. It settles quietly into families, shaping emotional responses, expectations, and even spiritual sensitivity. When grief is inherited, people carry sadness without knowing why, heaviness without a clear origin. Psalm 35 gives language to grief that comes from injustice. David speaks of sorrow, of fasting, of mourning for others who later turned against him. This is important because generational grief often begins with betrayal, loss, or trauma that was never processed properly. Instead of being healed, it becomes internalized. Families move on externally while wounds remain open internally. Over time, grief stops being a season and becomes an atmosphere. Psalm 17 brings grief into God's presence without shame. David does not hide his pain, but he also does not let pain define him. He asks God to hear his cry, to attend to his prayer. This teaches us that grief is not a weakness, it is a signal. When grief is acknowledged before God, it can be healed. When it is ignored, it quietly shapes identity and behavior. There are families where grief is inherited through silence. Losses are never discussed, emotions are minimized. Children sense sadness but are never given language for it. They grow up carrying emotional weight that does not belong to them. This kind of grief often manifests as anxiety, numbness, irritability, or unexplained heaviness. Psalm 35 shows that God is not distant from sorrow caused by injustice. He is attentive to it. Another danger of unresolved grief is emotional shutdown. To survive pain, people learn not to feel deeply. They protect themselves by staying guarded. Over time, this protection becomes isolation. Psalm 17's imagery of being held under God's wings invites vulnerability. It suggests safety. Healing grief requires safety, not pressure. Generational grief also affects faith. People believe in God, but struggle to trust Him fully. Prayer feels distant. Worship feels muted. This is not rebellion, it is pain that was never processed. Psalm 35 shows that God welcomes honest grief. David does not pretend to be unaffected. He speaks openly about his sorrow. God does not require composure before compassion. Psalm 17 also reminds us that God examines the heart at night. Nighttime often amplifies grief. Thoughts become heavier, memories resurface. Unprocessed sorrow often speaks loudest in quiet moments. But God's examination is not to expose weakness, it is to bring healing. He meets people where grief hides. Another way grief operates generationally is through fear of loss. People become overly cautious. They avoid attachment. They expect disappointment. This fear shapes decisions subtly. Psalm 35 confronts this by affirming that God restores joy. Grief does not have the final word. Restoration is possible. It is important to understand that healing grief does not dishonor the past. It honors it by refusing to let pain define the future. Psalm 17's confidence shows that acknowledging pain does not weaken faith, it deepens it. God does not ask you to forget what happened. He invites you to heal from it. There are people listening who feel sad without knowing why. Others feel emotionally tired, even when life seems stable. These are often signs of unresolved grief, not personal failure. You are not broken. You may simply be carrying something that was never healed. Psalm 35 shows that God sees sorrow caused by injustice, even across generations. Healing grief begins with acknowledgement, not analysis, not blame, acknowledgement. When grief is named, it begins to lose its grip. And prayer creates space for God to work gently. You do not need to rush healing, you need to allow it. As this resonates, take a moment to reflect on where grief may be present in your life or family. You do not need to identify every detail. If you feel led, place a single word or short phrase in the comments representing what you want prayer for, such as healing, loss, peace, or comfort. That simple act opens the door for prayer and agreement without pressure. Psalm 17 ends with satisfaction because grief was not ignored. Psalm 35 ends with praise because sorrow did not remain permanent. These psalms teach us that grief can coexist with faith, but it does not have to define it. God transforms sorrow, not by erasing history, but by restoring hope. Generational grief breaks when someone chooses to feel safely, to pray honestly, and to trust God with what hurts. When grief is brought into the light, it softens. When prayer surrounds it, it heals. You are not required to carry inherited sorrow alone. If grief has been part of your story, do not keep it buried. Place your word or phrase in the comments and allow this community to stand with you. Prayer does not rush healing, but it supports it, and support makes healing possible. Hold on to this truth. Comfort is being released, sorrow is being addressed, and what once settled quietly in your family line is beginning to lift. Remain attentive, because another layer of generational warfare often expresses itself through resistance to joy. Not the absence of happiness, but a quiet discomfort with joy when it appears. People smile, but they brace. They relax, but only briefly. When something good happens, they wait for it to end. This resistance is learned. It is inherited protection that once helped people survive disappointment, but now quietly blocks restoration. Psalm 35 confronts this resistance by expecting joy as an outcome, not an accident. David speaks of rejoicing, of praise, of gladness after vindication. He does not treat joy as irresponsible. He treats it as rightful. This matters because generational patterns often teach people to associate joy with vulnerability. If you celebrate, you risk loss. If you relax, you risk pain. Over time, people learn to keep joy at a distance. Psalm 17 restores safety around joy by anchoring it in God's presence. David's expectation of satisfaction is not shallow pleasure, it is deep peace. Satisfaction implies rest without fear. When joy is rooted in God, it is not fragile. It does not depend on circumstances staying perfect. It becomes a state of alignment rather than a temporary feeling. There are families where joy is treated cautiously. Good news is met with silence. Celebration feels awkward. People downplay blessings to avoid attention. This is not humility, it is learned defense. Joy once led to loss, so it became dangerous, but Psalm 35 shows that God restores joy openly. He does not ask his people to hide their gladness. He turns mourning into praise. Resistance to joy also affects prayer. People pray for relief, but not for delight. They ask God to remove pain, but not to restore enjoyment. Over time, faith becomes survival-focused. Psalm 17 pushes against this by expecting satisfaction. God does not only want to stop the bleeding, he wants to restore fullness. Another way this resistance shows up is through guilt around happiness. People feel guilty when they are at peace while others struggle. They feel uneasy enjoying what previous generations never had. This guilt keeps joy restrained. But God does not assign guilt to healing. Healing honors the past by refusing to repeat it. Psalm 35's praise is not disrespectful to suffering. It is evidence that suffering did not win. Joy resistance also keeps people hyper-alert. They are always scanning for what could go wrong. This vigilance feels responsible, but it drains energy. Psalm 17's image of being kept under God's wings invites rest. When protection is trusted, vigilance can relax. Joy becomes safer when protection is assured. Generational warfare often prefers people tired and serious. Joy disrupts control. Joy signals freedom. This is why Scripture repeatedly connects joy with strength. Psalm 35's expectation of rejoicing is not emotional excess. It is spiritual resilience. When joy returns, it means fear has lost ground. It is important to understand that joy is not denial. It does not erase memory or invalidate pain. It coexists with wisdom. But when joy is consistently resisted, healing stalls. God does not ask you to force joy. He invites you to receive it when it comes. Resistance softens when trust deepens. There are people listening who cannot remember the last time they felt unguarded happiness. Not excitement, but ease. Not laughter, but peace. This does not mean something is wrong with you. It may mean joy was never modeled safely. Psalm 17 shows that satisfaction is learned in God's presence. When you feel safe with him, joy becomes possible again. Psalm 35 also reveals that joy is often the result of justice. When wrongs are addressed, when pressure lifts, joy naturally follows. You do not need to manufacture it. You need to remove what blocks it. Generational resistance to joy weakens when truth is restored and protection is trusted. As this speaks to you, notice how you respond internally to moments of peace or happiness. Do you lean in or do you brace? Awareness is not judgment, it is invitation. And if you feel led, place a single word or short phrase in the comments representing what you desire God to restore in this area, such as joy, peace, rest, or freedom. You do not need to explain. That word is enough to invite prayer and agreement. Joy grows when it is prayed for without guilt. Peace deepens when it is allowed without fear. This community stands with you, not only for deliverance from pain, but for restoration of fullness. God is not glorified by perpetual heaviness. He is glorified by healed hearts. Psalm 17 ends with satisfaction because resistance gave way to trust. Psalm 35 ends with praise because justice made room for joy. These outcomes remind us that joy is not optional decoration. It is evidence of freedom. When joy returns, something has shifted deeply. If resistance to joy has been part of your story, do not keep that hidden. Place your word or phrase in the comments and allow this community to stand with you in prayer. Agreement creates safety. Safety allows joy to return. Hold on to this assurance. Joy is becoming safe again. Peace is settling in, and what once taught you to brace is losing its influence over your heart and life. Remain attentive, because another layer of generational warfare often operates through fear of authority. Not fear of God, but fear of taking responsibility, fear of leading, fear of deciding, fear of standing firm when opposition appears. This fear teaches people to stay small, to avoid visibility, and to retreat when pressure rises. Over time, it creates families where calling is present, but authority is never exercised. Psalm 35 confronts this fear directly. David does not shrink back when opposition intensifies. He does not ask God to remove responsibility from him. He asks God to stand with him as he confronts what is unjust. This is important because authority is not something you invent. It is something you step into. When David prays, he does so as someone aware that he has a role to play in the confrontation. God fights, but David still stands. Psalm 17 reinforces this by showing confidence without arrogance. David knows he can speak because God hears. Fear of authority often comes from fear of making mistakes. People hesitate because they believe one wrong decision will destroy everything. But God's examination of the heart provides safety. When your heart is aligned, authority does not require perfection. It requires obedience. Generational fear of authority often develops in environments where leadership was punished, criticized, or crushed. People watched those who stood up get attacked. They learned that visibility brings pain. Over time, the safest option seemed to be staying quiet, blending in, or letting others decide. But safety through avoidance eventually becomes limitation. Psalm 35 does not protect itself by avoiding confrontation. It protects itself by inviting God into it. Another way this fear manifests is through over-dependence. People wait for permission for everything. They seek constant confirmation. They doubt their own discernment. This can look spiritual, but it is often fear-based. Psalm 17 shows a balance. David seeks God's guidance, but he does not abdicate responsibility. He trusts God while acting with clarity. Fear of authority also weakens spiritual warfare. People pray defensively instead of declaratively. They ask God to fix things they are called to confront. But Psalm 35 is declarative. David names what is happening and calls for justice. This teaches us that prayer is not passive, it is participatory. God invites his people to stand with him, not hide behind him. There are families where authority was abused, and the response was to reject authority altogether. Others experienced chaos, and authority felt unsafe. In both cases, fear replaced confidence. But Psalm 17 shows that God's authority is protective, not oppressive. When authority is aligned with God, it brings order, not harm. Another subtle effect of this fear is delayed maturity. People remain in dependent roles longer than necessary. They hesitate to lead in their homes, communities, or spiritual lives. This hesitation keeps generational patterns intact. Cycles rarely break through passivity. They break when someone chooses to stand, even with trembling faith. Psalm 35 also reveals that opposition often increases when authority begins to emerge. David's enemies intensify their actions because his presence threatens them. This is important to understand. Resistance is not proof you are wrong. Often it is proof you are effective. Fear interprets resistance as danger. Faith interprets it as confirmation. Psalm 17's trust in God's protection stabilizes authority. David knows that standing does not mean standing alone. God covers those who step forward in alignment. This coverage allows authority to function without fear. When protection is trusted, courage grows. Generational fear of authority also affects boundaries. People struggle to say no, to enforce limits, to protect their time and peace. They fear disappointing others or creating conflict. But Psalm 35 shows that boundaries are part of justice. God draws lines. He intervenes. Boundaries are not rejection, they are order. It is important to recognize that stepping into authority does not mean becoming harsh. Authority rooted in God is calm, clear, and steady. It does not need to dominate to be effective. Psalm 17's gentle confidence shows that authority can coexist with humility. There are people listening who sense they are meant to lead in some capacity, in prayer, in family, in decision-making. But fear has kept them hesitant. This does not mean you lack calling. It often means calling has been delayed by inherited fear. Awareness is the first step toward freedom. As this resonates, consider where fear of authority may have influenced your choices. You do not need to resolve it all now. If you feel led, place a short word or phrase in the comments expressing where you want God to strengthen you, such as courage, confidence, leadership, or boldness. You are not declaring perfection, you are inviting prayer and agreement. Authority grows when it is supported by prayer. Courage strengthens when it is shared. This community exists not to pressure you, but to stand with you as you step into what God has already placed within you. Psalm 35 ends with praise because authority was exercised and justice followed. Psalm 17 ends with satisfaction because confidence was rooted in God's protection. These outcomes remind us that authority does not have to be feared. When aligned with God, it becomes a source of stability, not stress. Do not underestimate what can change when fear of authority loosens its grip. Decisions become clearer, boundaries strengthen, purpose begins to express itself naturally. What once felt intimidating becomes manageable. If fear of authority has shaped your story, do not keep that hidden. Place your word or phrase in the comments and allow this community to stand with you in prayer. Agreement reinforces courage, and courage weakens fear. Hold on to this assurance. Authority is being restored, fear is losing influence, and what once held you back is giving way to confidence grounded in God. There are moments when nothing dramatic is happening on the outside, yet something feels unsettled on the inside. No crisis, no obvious attack, just a quiet sense that something is unfinished, like a chapter that should have closed but never did. This feeling is not imagination. It is often the signal of unfinished spiritual business that has been carried across time. Generational warfare does not always show up as pain or chaos. Sometimes it shows up as incompletion, things that almost resolved but didn't, healing that started but stalled, change that was initiated but never sustained. Families move forward externally, but internally something remains unresolved. Psalm 35 and Psalm 17 speak directly to this kind of lingering tension. Psalm 35 reveals David dealing with battles that should have ended already, enemies that should have moved on, conflicts that no longer made sense. This tells us something important. Not every ongoing struggle is meant to be ongoing. Some battles persist simply because no one officially closed them. Spiritually speaking, unfinished matters linger until they are addressed with authority. Psalm 17 complements this by showing David inviting God to examine him fully, even in the quiet places. This matters because unfinished spiritual business often hides in areas people avoid revisiting. Old wounds, old injustices, old losses. Not because people lack faith, but because revisiting pain feels exhausting. Over time, avoidance becomes normal, but what is avoided remains active. There are family lines where nothing ever feels complete. Relationships remain strained but unspoken. Forgiveness is implied but never expressed. Closure is assumed but never confirmed. This creates emotional and spiritual limbo. People move on physically, but internally they remain tethered. Psalm 35 confronts this by demanding resolution. David does not settle for partial justice. He asks God to act decisively. Unfinished business also affects momentum. People struggle to fully commit to new seasons because part of them is still anchored in old ones. They hesitate to trust, to rest, to celebrate. Not because they are pessimistic, but because something feels unresolved. Psalm 17's prayer for protection and satisfaction points toward closure. Satisfaction implies completion, not continuation. Another way unfinished business manifests is through recurring memories. Certain moments replay, certain emotions resurface, not constantly, but unexpectedly. These are often signs that something was never fully processed. Psalm 35 shows that God is attentive to unresolved injustice. Time does not neutralize injustice. Truth does. When injustice is brought before God, it loses its ability to linger. Generationally, unfinished matters are often inherited silently. Children sense tension without context. Adults feel heaviness without clarity. Families normalize avoidance. But normalization does not equal resolution. Psalm 17's invitation for God to examine the heart breaks this pattern. Examination is not about reopening wounds unnecessarily. It is about closing what was left open. Unfinished spiritual business also affects prayer language. People pray broadly because specifics feel uncomfortable. They ask God to bless the future while avoiding the past. But Psalm 35 is specific. David names the conflict, he names the injustice, he names the desired outcome. Clarity accelerates resolution. It is important to understand that closure is not forgetting, it is integration. It is acknowledging what happened, releasing what no longer belongs to you, and allowing God to bring order. Psalm 17 shows that closure happens safely under God's care. You are not exposed when God examines you. You are covered. There are people listening who have sensed this incompletion for years, not in a dramatic way, but in subtle hesitation, a reluctance to fully trust peace, a tendency to stay guarded even in calm seasons. This is often the residue of unfinished spiritual business, and God does not expose this to overwhelm you. He exposes it to finish it. Psalm 35 teaches that God is willing to confront what people avoid. Psalm 17 teaches that he does so gently, with protection. Together they create a space where resolution is possible without re-traumatization. God does not rush healing, but he does complete it. Unfinished business also keeps people emotionally tied to roles they have outgrown. They remain caretakers, mediators, or peacemakers long after the need has passed. This drains energy and blurs identity. Psalm 35 breaks this by restoring rightful roles. Psalm 17 restores rest by reaffirming position under God's care. As this resonates, Take a moment to notice if there is something in your life that feels unresolved. You do not need to name it fully or analyze it deeply. Awareness is enough for now. And if you feel led, write a short prayer request in the comments related to closure, healing, or resolution. You might simply write closure, healing, or peace. That single word is enough to invite prayer and agreement. Resolution often begins when someone is willing to acknowledge incompletion without judgment. You are not failing because something remains unresolved. You are becoming aware, and awareness is the doorway to completion. Psalm 17 ends with satisfaction because nothing was left hanging. Psalm 35 ends with praise because justice was finished, not postponed. These endings remind us that God does not specialize in endless processes. He completes what he begins. You are not meant to carry unfinished battles indefinitely. What was paused can be resolved. What was delayed can be completed. What was avoided can be healed safely in God's presence. If unfinished spiritual business has been part of your story, do not keep that quiet. Place your word or short phrase in the comments and allow this community to stand with you in prayer. Agreement creates movement. Movement brings resolution. Hold on to this truth. Closure is being released, lingering matters are being addressed, and what once remained open is moving toward completion under God's care. It doesn't always feel dramatic when a generational pattern begins to break. Sometimes there is no surge of emotion, no sudden clarity, no visible sign that anything has changed. Instead, what shifts first is permission, a quiet inner permission to stop carrying what you were never meant to finish, a subtle release that tells you, this does not have to continue. That permission is powerful, and it is often the moment when spiritual authority starts to take effect. Psalm 35 shows us that David did not wait for circumstances to improve before he prayed with authority. He prayed from alignment, not from relief. He understood that permission to confront injustice comes from God, not from how safe the situation feels. This is important because many people wait for confirmation before they act, when God is waiting for alignment before he moves. Generational warfare weakens the moment permission shifts from tolerance to confrontation. Psalm 17 reinforces this by showing that permission is internal before it is external. David trusts that God has examined him and found him aligned. This internal confirmation gives him the freedom to ask boldly. When you know where you stand with God, you stop asking for permission from fear, from history, or from inherited expectation. You begin to move from truth instead of habit. There are family lines where people learn to endure instead of conclude. They were strong, faithful, resilient, but never free. Over time, endurance became identity. People were praised for surviving, not for resolving. But God does not only reward endurance, he completes cycles. Psalm 35 does not glorify suffering, it anticipates justice. Psalm 17 does not celebrate survival, it expects satisfaction. Permission also affects boundaries. When people lack permission internally, they overextend. They feel responsible for outcomes they cannot control. They struggle to step away from roles that no longer belong to them. But when permission is restored, boundaries become clearer. You no longer need to explain every decision. You no longer need to justify rest. You stop negotiating peace. Another sign of permission returning is emotional lightness, not constant happiness, but less heaviness. Decisions feel slightly easier. Resistance feels less intimidating. You still face challenges, but they no longer feel defining. This is often the first fruit of generational cycles loosening their grip. Psalm 35 describes this shift as relief from shame. Psalm 17 describes it as safety under God's care. Permission also changes how people pray. Instead of asking God to fix everything, they begin to pray with specificity. They name what needs to end. They name what needs to heal. They name what needs to be restored. Specific prayer is a sign of internal authority, Psalm 35 models this clearly. David does not generalize injustice, he addresses it. He trusts that God can handle clarity. Generational warfare thrives in vagueness. When things are never named, they are never resolved. Permission breaks vagueness. It allows you to say, "This stops here," without needing to argue with the past. You do not need to convince history. You need to align with truth. Psalm 17 also teaches us that permission does not mean isolation. David invites God's involvement deeply. He does not rely solely on self-awareness. He remains dependent, connected, and humble. Permission is not independence from God. It is confidence with God. This balance protects you from arrogance while empowering you to stand. There are people listening who have felt a quiet inner shift recently. Nothing external changed, but something internal softened. Old pressure felt less urgent. Old fear felt less convincing. This is often the beginning of freedom. God loosens what was bound before he removes it completely. He prepares the heart before he changes the environment. Permission also allows grief to complete, joy to return, and expectation to rise. Without permission, people suppress all three. With permission, emotions begin to move again. Healing requires movement. Psalm 35 shows movement toward justice. Psalm 17 shows movement toward peace. Together, they guide the soul out of stagnation. It is important to understand that permission does not erase responsibility. It redirects it. You are no longer responsible for maintaining patterns. You become responsible for alignment. God handles outcomes. You handle obedience. This exchange brings relief. Generational patterns often rely on internal agreements. This is just how it is. Nothing ever changes. We don't get that. Permission breaks these agreements quietly. You do not need to confront every belief out loud. The moment you stop agreeing internally, power shifts. As this speaks to you, notice where you may have felt permission returning recently, or where you desire it to return. You do not need to analyze it fully. If you feel led, place a short word or phrase in the comments that represents what you are asking God for permission to release or receive. It might be peace, closure, rest, freedom, or direction. That word is enough to invite prayer and agreement. Permission grows stronger when it is supported. Agreement reinforces internal shifts. This community stands not to pressure you, but to support the work God is already doing quietly within you. What begins internally often becomes visible in time. Psalm 35 ends with praise because permission led to justice. Psalm 17 ends with satisfaction because permission led to peace. These outcomes remind us that God does not stir awareness without intention. He begins what he plans to finish. You are not imagining this shift. You are not becoming careless. You are becoming aligned, and alignment brings authority without striving. If permission has been something you've been missing, permission to rest, to heal, to move on, to expect more, do not carry that alone. Place your word or phrase in the comments and allow this community to stand with you in prayer. Agreement strengthens what God has already initiated. Hold on to this assurance. Permission is being restored, internal agreements are changing, and what once held you in place is beginning to release under God's guidance and care. There are things in your life that should have ended years ago, and you know it. Patterns that no longer make sense, battles you didn't choose, weights you never volunteered to carry, yet somehow they stayed. Not because God failed, not because you lacked faith, but because what was generational was never confronted at the root. This is where this moment becomes confrontational. Psalm 35 and Psalm 17 are not gentle reflections. They are legal prayers. They are courtroom language. David is not asking God to comfort him while injustice continues. He is asking God to intervene, expose, and put an end to what should not still be operating. That is a different posture, and it requires honesty. Many people don't confront generational warfare because deep down they are afraid of what will surface if they do. They fear reopening wounds, stirring memories, or disrupting fragile peace. But here is the truth. Fragile peace is not peace at all. It is tension with a smile. And tension, over time, becomes a breeding ground for repeated attacks. Psalm 35 makes something very clear. Some battles persist because silence protected them. David says his enemies acted without cause, in secret, through traps and deception. That tells us something important. Generational attacks are rarely loud at first. They operate quietly, through patterns, through emotional responses, through learned behaviors that feel normal because they've always been there. Psalm 17 pulls the curtain back further by showing us where the real fight is won, the inner place. David invites God to examine him at night, the place of thoughts, memories, fears, and questions. Generational warfare survives when people avoid looking inward. Healing begins when someone is brave enough to say, God, search this fully. Here is the hard truth most people avoid. Some of what follows families is sustained by unspoken agreement, not conscious agreement, emotional agreement. Statements like, this always happens to us, we're just unlucky, nothing ever lasts, we don't get happy endings. These thoughts may feel realistic, but they are not neutral. They are agreements that give patterns permission to remain. Psalm 35 breaks agreement by demanding reversal. David does not accept that what has happened should continue. He asks God to turn the situation around, to shame what opposed him, to bring clarity and justice. This is not revenge, it is restoration of order. God's justice is not about punishment, it is about alignment. Psalm 17 reinforces that alignment begins when identity is settled. David knows who he is before God. That is why he can ask boldly. People who don't know where they stand with God often hesitate to confront what follows them. They fear being wrong. They fear being exposed. But when identity is clear, fear loses leverage. This block is confrontational because confrontation is sometimes the only language patterns understand. There are people listening who have prayed for peace, but never for closure. Prayed for strength, but never for conclusion. Prayed for protection, but never for exposure. And as a result, cycles slowed, but they didn't stop. Psalm 35 and 17 are not prayers for delay. They are prayers for decision. Generational attacks often rely on emotional exhaustion. They wait until people are tired of hoping, tired of praying, tired of explaining. That fatigue makes resignation feel wise. But resignation is not maturity. It is surrender to repetition. And repetition only ends when someone decides it ends. Psalm 17's request to be kept under God's wings is not about hiding from confrontation. It is about being protected while confronting it. God does not send you into exposure unguarded. He covers those he calls forward. That is why this moment matters. You are not being stirred to relive pain. You are being invited to close a door. Another uncomfortable truth. Some families survived by adapting instead of healing. Adaptation kept them alive, but it also normalized dysfunction. Over time, adaptation becomes identity. People confuse coping mechanisms with personality. Psalm 35 disrupts this by restoring truth. David is not what his enemies say he is, and you are not what survival forced you to become. This is why the 7 times declaration is critical. You are not casually reading scripture, you are applying sustained pressure. Patterns that survived through repetition are dismantled through repetition, aligned with truth. Each declaration reinforces a boundary. Each repetition withdraws permission. If something in you feels stirred, uncomfortable, or exposed right now, that does not mean something is wrong. It often means something is being challenged. Exposure precedes eviction. Light precedes freedom. Psalm 35 exposes injustice. Psalm 17 secures the heart. Together, they dismantle what followed you like a shadow. Now listen carefully. You do not need to carry everything you survived. You do not need to honor the past by repeating it. You do not need to prove loyalty by staying bound. God does not heal families by preserving pain. He heals them by ending it. If there is a specific area where you are tired of seeing the same battle repeat, emotionally, spiritually, relationally, or mentally, do this now. Write a short, honest prayer request in the comments. Not a testimony, not an explanation. Just name the area. It could be family, fear, marriage, finances, mind, or peace. That act is not weakness. It is confrontation. When you name it, you stop protecting it. When you bring it into prayer, you remove its hiding place. And when agreement surrounds it, its authority weakens. This is not about emotion. This is about decision. Psalm 35 ends with the enemy silenced. Psalm 17 ends with the soul satisfied. That is not poetic language. That is outcome language. And this outcome is not theoretical. It is available when someone finally says, enough. Hold on to this truth as we continue. What followed you does not define you. What repeated does not own you. And what survived in silence is being confronted now. Before you dismiss what you're feeling right now, pause and recognize this. Not every inner reaction is emotional. Some reactions are spiritual confirmations. When truth gets close to the root of a problem, something inside you responds. Sometimes with relief, sometimes with resistance, sometimes with clarity that feels uncomfortable. That response matters. Generational warfare often survives because it hides behind familiarity. When something has been present for a long time, it stops feeling like an intruder and starts feeling like part of life. People adjust, they compensate, they build routines around it. But Psalm 35 does not negotiate with familiarity. David does not ask whether the battle is old or new. He asks whether it is just, and if it is not, he calls for divine intervention. Psalm 17 adds an important layer here. David is not only confronting what is happening around him, he is stabilizing what is happening within him. He invites God to examine his heart, especially in the quiet moments. This tells us something critical. Lasting breakthrough does not come only from external confrontation, but from internal alignment. When the heart is steady, confrontation becomes effective. One of the reasons generational attacks persist is because people fight symptoms instead of roots. They address surface issues, behavior, habits, circumstances, without touching the underlying agreements that allowed those issues to form. Psalm 35 targets the source. It calls out those who contend without cause. It refuses to accept confusion, injustice, or repetition as normal. Root-level prayer produces root-level change. Psalm 17 supports this by protecting identity during the process. When roots are exposed, people can feel vulnerable. Old memories surface, old questions reappear, but God's protection ensures that exposure does not become harm. You are not being destabilized, you are being realigned. God does not uproot without intending to replant something healthier. There are people listening who have tried many times to fix their situation. You adjusted habits, you changed environments, you improved boundaries, and yet something still followed. This is often because the issue was never purely situational. It was systemic. Generational systems do not respond fully to surface adjustments. They respond to authority and truth. Psalm 35 shows us that authority does not mean aggression. It means clarity. David is clear about what he will no longer tolerate. He does not ask God to make him comfortable with injustice. He asks God to confront it. Comfort can coexist with injustice for a season. Clarity cannot. Psalm 17 reminds us that clarity is safest when rooted in God's presence. David does not confront from anger, he confronts from alignment. This matters because confrontation without alignment creates chaos. Alignment without confrontation creates stagnation. The two together create movement. Another reason generational patterns persist is because people underestimate their own authority. They believe change requires more power than they possess. But Scripture consistently shows that authority flows from position, not strength. David does not overpower his enemies by force. He positions himself under God's justice. That position changes outcomes. This is where many people hesitate. They fear overstepping. They worry about being presumptuous. But Psalm 17 shows that when God has examined the heart, boldness is not presumption. It is obedience. You are not demanding something God never promised. You are aligning with what He already intends. Generational warfare also relies on distraction. When life becomes busy, urgent, or overwhelming, deeper issues remain untouched. People say, "I'll deal with this later," and later never comes. Psalm 35 disrupts this delay by bringing urgency. David does not postpone justice. He calls for it now, not because he's impatient, but because injustice left unresolved multiplies. Psalm 17 balances urgency with trust. David knows that timing matters, but he also knows that delay is not the same as denial. This balance keeps prayer from becoming anxious or passive. It keeps the heart steady while action is taken. If you feel a growing sense of clarity right now, even if it feels challenging, that is often a sign that alignment is happening. Clarity can feel uncomfortable when it contradicts long-held patterns, but discomfort is not danger. Sometimes it is the sensation of a boundary being drawn. There are people who sense that something must change, but they are unsure how to name it. You don't need perfect language. You don't need a full explanation. What matters is willingness. Willingness opens the door for God to work where words fall short. If you feel prompted, take a moment now and leave a brief prayer request in the comments, naming the area where you need God's intervention at the root. You can keep it simple. You might write family patterns, mental peace, spiritual clarity, or freedom. This is not about visibility. It is about alignment. When you name it, you invite prayer to meet it. Psalm 35 assures us that God responds to clarity with action. Psalm 17 assures us that God protects the heart while action unfolds. These two truths together create safety and momentum. You are not late to this process. You are not reopening what should have stayed buried. You are allowing God to finish what was left unresolved. Finishing brings peace. Finishing brings freedom. Hold on to this as we continue. Roots are being addressed. Authority is being exercised. And what followed you quietly is being confronted openly. This is not imagination. It is alignment in motion. There comes a point when awareness is no longer enough. You can recognize patterns, name cycles, understand roots, and still feel something unresolved. That's because recognition prepares the ground, but decision changes the territory. Generational warfare weakens when awareness rises, but it breaks when a decision is made in alignment with God. Psalm 35 is a psalm of decision. David is not undecided about what he wants God to do. He does not ask for partial relief. He does not ask for temporary peace. He asks God to take sides, to enter the conflict, and to end what is unjust. That level of clarity matters because spiritual resistance often lingers where decisions remain incomplete. Psalm 17 supports this decisiveness by anchoring it in trust. David is decisive without being reckless. He knows who God is, and because of that, he knows what he can ask for. Decision without trust becomes control. Trust without decision becomes passivity. Together they form authority. Many people remain stuck, not because they lack faith, but because they are divided internally. Part of them wants change, while another part fears disruption. They want freedom, but they fear what freedom might require them to release. Generational patterns exploit this tension. As long as the heart hesitates, cycles remain negotiable. Psalm 35 removes negotiation. David draws a clear line. What is fighting me will not continue unchecked. He does not need to know every detail of the enemy's strategy. He knows enough to bring the case to God. This teaches us that decision does not require full understanding. It requires alignment. Psalm 17 reinforces that alignment by stabilizing the inner world. David is not frantic. He is resolved. Resolution carries a different spiritual weight than desperation. Desperation pleads. Resolution stands. God responds differently to each. Resolution signals readiness. Another reason decision is difficult is because people fear consequences. What if things change? What if relationships shift? What if familiar dynamics are disrupted? These fears are understandable, especially in family systems where peace was maintained through compromise. But Psalm 35 shows that peace built on injustice is fragile. True peace requires truth. Decision also exposes loyalty conflicts. People worry that breaking patterns means dishonoring those who came before them. But breaking cycles is not betrayal, it is redemption. Psalm 17 shows that honoring God does not dishonor family. It heals what family could not heal on its own. Generational warfare often survives because people delay decisions indefinitely. One day, when things settle, when I feel stronger, but strength often comes after the decision, not before it. David does not wait to feel strong before praying boldly. He prays boldly because he knows where his strength comes from. Psalm 35 also reveals that God responds to decisive prayer with movement. David expects things to shift. He expects confusion to come upon those who oppose him. He expects justice to be visible. Expectation is the fruit of decision. When you decide, you begin to expect. Psalm 17 guards this expectation by rooting it in God's character, not outcomes. David's confidence is not in immediate results, but in God's faithfulness. This protects the heart from discouragement if change unfolds gradually. Decision does not mean instant results, it means sustained alignment. There are people listening who are standing at a quiet crossroads. Nothing dramatic is forcing a choice, but something inside knows a line needs to be drawn. This is often the most important kind of decision, the one made without pressure, out of clarity. God honors these moments deeply. Decision also affects how prayer sounds. When people are undecided, prayers are vague. When people decide, prayers become specific. Psalm 35 is specific. David names what must stop and what must change. Psalm 17 supports this specificity by ensuring the heart remains steady while speaking clearly. Another hidden effect of decision is relief, not because everything is fixed, but because ambiguity ends. Ambiguity is exhausting. Decision simplifies the inner landscape. Even difficult paths feel lighter when they are chosen consciously rather than avoided unconsciously. Generational patterns often rely on ambiguity to survive. When things are never clearly named, they remain flexible enough to persist. Decision removes flexibility. It introduces boundaries. Boundaries are uncomfortable at first, but they are stabilizing long-term. It is important to understand that decision does not mean confrontation with people. It means confrontation with patterns. You do not need to argue with anyone to break a cycle. You need to align with truth. God handles the rest. Psalm 35 brings God into the confrontation. Psalm 17 keeps the heart protected while God works. If you sense that a decision is forming within you, even if you cannot articulate it fully yet, pay attention to that. It may be the moment when a generational agreement is quietly breaking. You do not need to rush it, but you also do not need to ignore it. As this speaks to you, consider where a decision may be needed in your life. Not a dramatic one, perhaps simply a decision to no longer tolerate a certain pattern internally. If you feel led, place a brief prayer request in the comments related to clarity, courage, or resolution. You can keep it simple. This is not about explanation, it is about agreement. When decision is supported by prayer, it strengthens. Psalm 35 assures us that God responds to decisive alignment. Psalm 17 assures us that God protects those who stand with him. These assurances remove fear from decision-making. You are not stepping into uncertainty alone. You are stepping into alignment with God's justice and care. Remember this: awareness opened your eyes, but decision moves your feet. What you decide in alignment with God reshapes what follows you. Patterns lose permission when decisions are clear. You are not being asked to fix everything today. You are being invited to decide what will no longer define tomorrow. That is enough to begin change. If a decision is forming in you, do not carry it alone. Place your prayer request in the comments and allow this community to stand with you. Agreement reinforces resolve, and resolve weakens resistance. Hold on to this truth. Clarity is increasing, decisions are aligning, and what once lingered through indecision is losing its place in your life under God's guidance. Not the part that explains, not the part that prays out loud, the part that knows something is shifting but can't yet describe it. This is often where generational warfare makes its last stand. When patterns begin to lose authority, they don't always attack harder. Sometimes they confuse, rush, or pressure. They try to force movement without alignment. They whisper urgency without clarity. And many people mistake that pressure for God. But Psalm 35 and Psalm 17 teach us something different. God never rushes alignment. He establishes it. Psalm 35 shows David refusing to be hurried by opposition. Even under pressure, he is deliberate. He names what is happening. He calls God into it. He does not react impulsively. This matters because generational systems love reaction. Reaction keeps people moving without thinking, changing without healing, shifting without closing doors. Reaction creates motion, but not freedom. Psalm 17 steadies the inner world, so reaction loses power. David invites God to search him, especially in the quiet places. This is where rushed decisions are slowed and clarified. God does not pressure you into freedom. He leads you into it. Pressure creates anxiety. Guidance creates peace. Knowing the difference is crucial when cycles are breaking. There are moments when resistance increases, not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are doing something new internally. Old patterns feel threatened when you stop reacting automatically. When you pause, when you listen, when you choose alignment over impulse. That pause is powerful. It removes momentum from what once controlled you. Generational warfare often trained people to move fast emotionally, fix it quickly, smooth it over, avoid conflict, adapt immediately. Over time, speed became safety. But safety built on speed is fragile. Psalm 35 shows that safety comes from justice, not avoidance. Psalm 17 shows that justice is safest when the heart is anchored. Another tactic that appears at this stage is false urgency. Thoughts like, "You need to decide now. You're running out of time. If you don't act immediately, you'll miss your chance." This pressure can feel spiritual, but it often isn't. God invites, he doesn't rush, he leads, he doesn't shove. Urgency without peace is rarely divine. Psalm 35's confidence allows David to wait without surrendering. Psalm 17's trust allows him to rest without disengaging. This balance dismantles false urgency. You are not late, you are not behind, you are not missing your moment, you are being positioned. There are people listening who feel torn between moving forward and holding back. This tension is not failure, it is discernment awakening. Discernment pauses before it proceeds, it listens before it acts. And when discernment rises, generational noise loses volume. This is also where patience gets redefined. Patience is not passivity, it is strength under control. Psalm 35 is patient without being passive. Psalm 17 is calm without being inactive. Together they show that patience is often the posture that precedes decisive movement. Another reason pressure increases at this stage is because old identities resist change. When you stop reacting, you stop playing your old role. The peacemaker who absorbed everything, the fixer who carried everyone, the strong one who never asked. When those roles loosen, systems feel exposed. Exposure often feels uncomfortable before it feels free. Psalm 35 does not protect old roles. It restores truth. Psalm 17 does not cling to old identities. It anchors new ones. This is why this moment feels different. You are not just changing behavior. You are stepping out of agreement with roles that were never meant to define you forever. Pressure also tries to distract you with side issues, minor conflicts, emotional spikes, old conversations resurfacing. This is not coincidence. Distraction attempts to pull attention away from alignment. Psalm 35 keeps focus on the real issue. Psalm 17 keeps the heart guarded while focus is maintained. If you feel mentally scattered lately, pause instead of pushing. Scattering is often a sign that something important is being challenged. Clarity returns when pressure is resisted, not obeyed. God does not compete with noise. He waits for stillness. There are families where pressure became normal. People learned to operate under constant tension. Calm felt unfamiliar. Stillness felt unsafe. But God does not heal through pressure. He heals through presence. Psalm 17's imagery of being held under God's wings is not poetic, it is corrective. It retrains the nervous system of the soul. Pressure also distorts prayer. People pray frantically instead of faithfully. They repeat words instead of resting in truth. Psalm 35 and 17 model something else. Steady, grounded prayer. Prayer that knows where it stands. Prayer that does not need to rush God because it trusts Him. If this resonates, notice where pressure has been influencing your decisions lately. You don't need to judge yourself for it. Awareness is enough. And if you feel led, write a short prayer request in the comments asking for peace, clarity, or stability in a specific area of your life. You don't need to explain the whole story. Even a single word invites agreement. Pressure weakens when peace is invited. Confusion quiets when clarity is prayed for, and alignment strengthens when it is supported by community prayer. Psalm 35 assures us that God does not abandon those under pressure. Psalm 17 assures us that He protects the heart while truth settles. These promises remove the need to rush. You can move forward at the pace of alignment, not anxiety. Let this settle. You are not being pushed into something uncertain. You are being led out of something old. Pressure is losing influence. Discernment is rising. And what once rushed you is beginning to slow under God's guidance. If pressure has been loud in your life, don't carry it silently. Place your prayer request in the comments and allow this community to stand with you. Agreement creates calm, and calm restores clarity. Hold on to this truth. Urgency is being replaced with peace, reaction with alignment, and pressure with protection. What once tried to rush you is losing its authority. Some of the strongest chains don't feel like chains anymore. They feel like habits. They feel like personality. They feel like, this is just how I am. That's why this layer is dangerous. Generational warfare often survives by blending in. When something has been around long enough, it stops being questioned. People stop asking where it came from. They stop wondering if it should still be there. And slowly, what began as an attack turns into an identity trait. Psalm 35 and Psalm 17 confront this directly because God never confuses survival patterns with calling. Psalm 35 shows David refusing to normalize opposition. He does not say, this has been happening for a long time, so I'll adjust. He says, contend with those who contend with me. In other words, time does not legitimize injustice. Longevity does not equal permission. Just because something has been present doesn't mean it is authorized. Psalm 17 strengthens this stance by anchoring identity in God's examination, not in experience. David does not define himself by what he endured. He defines himself by who God says he is. This is critical because generational patterns love to rename endurance as destiny. They want you to believe that what you learned to live with is what you were meant to live as. Here's where it gets uncomfortable and necessary. Some people have mistaken coping mechanisms for character. Hyper-independence became strength. Emotional numbness became self-control. Overthinking became wisdom. Avoidance became peacekeeping. These adaptations may have helped you survive something real, but survival is not the finish line. Psalm 35 does not celebrate coping, it demands justice. Psalm 17 does not protect dysfunction, it restores wholeness. Generational warfare often teaches people to adapt instead of heal. Healing requires vulnerability. Adaptation requires alertness. Over time, alertness becomes exhausting. People stay guarded even when danger has passed. They brace even when God is providing peace. This constant readiness becomes a prison disguised as responsibility. Psalm 17's imagery of being kept under God's wings is deeply corrective here. It suggests safety without vigilance, protection without hyper-awareness, rest without loss of control. For someone trained by generational pressure, that can feel foreign, even unsafe at first. But safety that feels unfamiliar is often real safety. Psalm 35 also reveals something important. When injustice is normalized, people begin to defend what hurts them. They explain it, they rationalize it, they minimize it. They say things like, "It could be worse," or "That's just how our family is." But God does not ask you to protect what He intends to remove. Another way this blending happens is through humor. Families joke about dysfunction. Pain is laughed off. Struggle becomes a shared punchline. Humor can be healthy, but it can also be a shield. Psalm 35 cuts through that by taking pain seriously without becoming bitter. God does not need you to dramatize your pain, but He also does not need you to disguise it. Psalm 17 balances this by keeping the heart soft. David invites examination without self-contempt. This is important. When identity begins to separate from coping, people sometimes feel exposed. They wonder, if I'm not this, then who am I? God does not remove old layers without preparing new ground. Identity is not erased, it is clarified. There are people listening who feel tired of being the strong one, tired of being the fixer, tired of being the calm one in chaos. These roles may have been necessary once, but they are not eternal assignments. Psalm 35 breaks roles imposed by injustice. Psalm 17 restores roles rooted in relationship. Generational systems often reward functionality over health. As long as things work, no one questions the cost. But God is not impressed by functionality that drains the soul. He values truth over performance. When truth surfaces, systems shift, sometimes quietly, sometimes abruptly. This is why resistance sometimes shows up when people begin to rest. Not because rest is wrong, but because rest threatens systems built on overfunctioning. Psalm 35 confronts the system. Psalm 17 protects the person. Together they allow rest to become safe. Another sign that identity and coping are separating is emotional unfamiliarity. You may notice reactions changing. Things that once triggered you don't hit the same way, or new emotions surface, grief, anger, relief, without clear cause. This is often part of recalibration. The nervous system of the soul is learning something new. God does not rush this process. He's patient, but He is intentional. Psalm 35 shows intention toward justice. Psalm 17 shows patience toward the heart. You are not expected to know who you are becoming immediately. You are only invited to stop clinging to who you had to be. There are family lines where authenticity was unsafe. People learned to perform roles to maintain stability. Over time, authenticity felt risky. But healing requires honesty. Psalm 35 models honest confrontation. Psalm 17 models honest surrender. Neither requires perfection, only willingness. If this is resonating and you feel like certain traits, habits, or roles no longer fit, but you're not sure what replaces them yet, and that's okay. That in-between space is not confusion, it's transition. God often loosens before he replaces. As this settles, take a moment and ask yourself gently, what have I been calling me that might actually be a response to pressure? You don't need to answer it fully. Curiosity is enough for now. And if you feel led, place a brief prayer request in the comments, naming what you are ready to release or what you want God to restore in your sense of self. You might write identity, rest, healing, freedom, or clarity. One word is enough. When you name it, you invite prayer into that space. This community does not pray to force change. We pray to support alignment, and alignment allows God to do what only he can do. Restore without harm, remove without loss, and rebuild without fear. Psalm 35 ends with praise because false definitions lost their power. Psalm 17 ends with satisfaction because identity settled into truth. That same movement is available here. You are not losing yourself. You are being disentangled from what was never truly you. And what follows you from this point forward will look different, not because you tried harder, but because truth took its place. Hold on to this. Identity is clarifying. Old roles are loosening. And what once blended into your life unnoticed is being separated gently but firmly under God's care. Not into silence, but into truth without noise. Because when generational patterns are close to breaking, they often stop fighting loudly and start negotiating internally. They don't say, stay bound. They say, is this really that serious? They minimize, they soften. They suggest that maybe nothing needs to change after all. This is one of the last defenses of a cycle. Psalm 35 does not negotiate. David does not ask whether the battle deserves attention. He already knows it does. He brings it before God with clarity and firmness. This matters because negotiation keeps cycles alive. As long as something is maybe, it remains tolerated. And what is tolerated continues. Psalm 17 strengthens this stance by anchoring certainty inside the heart. David is not frantic. He is not trying to convince himself. He speaks from settled ground. That is what generational systems fear most. A person who is no longer confused, no longer debating internally, no longer splitting their loyalty between truth and familiarity. There is a subtle exhaustion that comes from constantly questioning your own discernment. Am I overreacting? Is this really spiritual? Maybe this is just life. Those questions feel reasonable, but when they repeat endlessly, they become a trap. Psalm 35 cuts through that by affirming that unjust patterns deserve confrontation. Psalm 17 affirms that discernment is trustworthy when the heart is aligned. Generational warfare often survives because people keep reopening the same internal debate. They decide something needs to change, then reconsider. They set a boundary, then feel guilty. They recognize a pattern, then minimize it. This back and forth drains resolve, but resolve is not stubbornness. It is clarity that has stopped arguing with itself. Psalm 35 shows David no longer arguing internally. He has reached a conclusion. Something is wrong, and God must intervene. Psalm 17 shows that this conclusion does not harden the heart, it steadies it. Certainty does not require aggression, it requires alignment. Another tactic that appears here is false compassion. People fear that ending a pattern means lacking grace. They worry that clarity equals judgment. But grace does not mean allowing harm to continue. Grace heals, grace restores, grace confronts what damages. Psalm 35 is full of grace because it seeks restoration through justice, not through avoidance. Psalm 17 reminds us that God's compassion does not require self-abandonment. You are not more loving because you keep absorbing damage. You are not more spiritual because you tolerate what drains you. God's protection implies limits. Limits are not cruelty. They are care. There are families where everyone learned to be understanding, but no one learned to be free. Understanding became a cage. Psalm 35 breaks that cage by insisting that God address what understanding alone could not fix. Psalm 17 keeps the heart tender while freedom is pursued. Negotiation also shows up as delay. I'll deal with this later. Now isn't the right time. Things are calm, so I won't stir anything. Calm built on avoidance is fragile. Psalm 35 does not wait for chaos to justify action. It acts because injustice already exists. Peace does not require silence. It requires truth. Psalm 17 ensures that action does not destabilize the soul. David knows he is protected. That protection allows him to be honest without fear of collapse. You are not risking everything by telling the truth. You are trusting God to hold you while truth settles. At this stage, some people feel an urge to pull back, to disengage emotionally, to go numb again. This is often the system trying to regain control. Numbness feels safer than clarity when clarity demands change, but numbness is not peace. Psalm 17's satisfaction is not numbness, it is fullness. If you notice yourself wanting to downplay what God has been revealing, pause. That pause is not failure. It is a moment of choice. You don't need to force anything. But you also don't need to undo what clarity has already begun. Psalm 35 assures us that God is not confused about what needs to end. Psalm 17 assures us that God will protect what needs to heal. These two truths remove the need to negotiate with fear. There are people listening who know exactly which pattern they keep second-guessing. You don't need to announce it. You don't need to confront anyone today. But you do need to stop convincing yourself that it doesn't matter. It matters because it has followed you, and what follows you deserves clarity. As this lands, if you feel led, place a short prayer request in the comments naming the area where you are asking God for firmness and clarity. Not emotion, not urgency, just steadiness. You might write clarity, boundaries, truth, or peace. That single word is enough. Agreement strengthens resolve. This community exists to support alignment, not pressure. When many stand together in prayer, internal negotiations lose strength. Resolve becomes easier to hold. Hold on to this truth as we continue. What God is clarifying does not need to be renegotiated. What He is exposing does not need to be minimized. You are not being extreme. You are being aligned, and alignment, once established, is very hard for old patterns to survive. There is a moment in every long spiritual battle when the issue is no longer the enemy, it is permission. Not God's permission, yours, not spoken permission, but internal permission. The quiet agreement that says, this is allowed to stay, or the decisive shift that says, this no longer has access to me. Generational warfare survives on unrevoked permission. Psalm 35 is powerful because David revokes access. He does not simply ask God to comfort him while enemies remain nearby. He asks God to confront, to block, to stop. That language matters. It signals a withdrawal of tolerance. David is no longer coexisting with what opposes him. He is asking God to take over the space. Psalm 17 supports this by showing where permission is first removed, inside the heart. David invites God to examine him, to test him, to confirm alignment. This inner clarity removes the enemy's favorite argument. You don't have the right to ask for this. Once the heart is settled, access is denied. Many people think generational patterns stay because they are powerful. Often, they stay because they were never explicitly dismissed, not welcomed, just never confronted. Silence, delay, and adaptation create a kind of passive permission. Psalm 35 breaks that silence. Psalm 17 seals the decision internally. There are family systems where people learn to make space for dysfunction, not because they wanted it, but because it felt unavoidable. Over time, making space became habit. Habits become environments. Environments shape identity, but what once felt unavoidable is not unchangeable. permission can be revoked. Revoking permission does not require confrontation with people. It requires alignment with truth. You don't need to announce anything. You don't need to justify your decision. The most powerful shifts happen quietly, when internal agreement changes. Psalm 35 shows that God responds to internal alignment with external action. Another reason permission is hard to revoke is fear of consequences. People worry that if they stop tolerating something, everything will fall apart. But often, what falls apart was being held together by exhaustion. Psalm 17's image of being kept under God's wings speaks directly to this fear. You are not exposed when you stop carrying what you were never meant to carry. You are covered. Generational warfare also relies on emotional loyalty. People feel guilty withdrawing permission because it feels like betrayal. But ending a pattern is not betrayal. It is stewardship. You are responsible for what you carry forward, not for preserving what harmed you. Psalm 35 seeks justice, not vengeance. Psalm 17 seeks protection, not separation from God. When permission is revoked, things often feel quieter before they feel better. There is a pause, a stillness. Old noise fades, new direction hasn't fully emerged yet. This in-between can feel unsettling if you're used to constant pressure, but stillness is not absence, it is recalibration. Psalm 17 shows that satisfaction comes after alignment, not before. You don't revoke permission because everything feels safe. Things feel safer because permission has been revoked. The order matters. Another sign permission is shifting is reduced emotional reaction. Things that once triggered intense responses now feel distant. This does not mean you are disengaged. It means access has changed. The system no longer knows how to reach you the same way. Psalm 35 describes enemies losing ground. Psalm 17 describes the heart remaining intact. Generational patterns often test boundaries after permission is revoked. They look for old access points, old guilt, old fear, old obligation. This is normal. It does not mean the decision failed. It means the boundary is being noticed. Consistency, not intensity, secures the shift. You're not required to defend your peace to anyone. You are not obligated to re-explain decisions that were made in alignment with God. Psalm 35 does not argue with the enemy. It hands the case to God. Psalm 17 does not justify itself. It rests in protection. If you feel a quiet resolve settling in you, not emotional, not dramatic, just firm, that is often the sound of permission being revoked. That firmness does not need to shout. It only needs to remain. As this resonates, take a moment to consider where permission may still be quietly active in your life, not because you want it there, but because it was never questioned. If you feel led, place a short prayer request in the comments asking God to help you revoke access in that area and strengthen your boundaries. You might write peace, boundaries, family, mind, or freedom. One word is enough. Agreement reinforces resolve. This community is here to stand with you as permission shifts, not to pressure you, but to support alignment. When many pray together, boundaries hold more easily. Hold on to this truth. What once stayed because it was tolerated is now being challenged. Permission is changing. Access is closing. And what followed you quietly is losing its right to remain under God's authority and care. There are battles you've been fighting that were never yours to fight. You've carried burdens that didn't belong to you. You've endured pressure that wasn't yours to handle. You fought enemies that weren't meant to have access to your peace, your joy, your future. The truth is, some of the battles that have defined your life were not given to you by God. They were passed down, inherited, and then accepted as yours to carry. And now, the time has come to release them. Psalm 35 is a powerful reminder that God fights for you. David didn't ask God to help him survive a battle that was already lost. He asked for victory. He didn't ask for comfort in the midst of his struggle. He asked for justice. He knew his God wasn't just a God of endurance. He was a God of conquest. David understood something crucial. When God enters the battlefield, the terms change. Victory becomes inevitable, but that doesn't just happen when you hope for it. It happens when you stop fighting battles that were never yours, and when you allow God to intervene in places where you've been trying to do it all yourself. Psalm 17 complements this by showing us God's protection and the peace that comes from surrendering the fight to Him. David's prayer was not one of self-defense, but one of surrendering the need to defend himself. He was confident that God, the ultimate protector, was with him. This is where the shift happens, when you realize you are not meant to fight alone. Many people feel as though they are constantly in a battle. They fight for their relationships, their careers, their health, and their peace of mind, often with nothing but their own strength to rely on. This is exhausting. It leaves you drained and discouraged, not because you're weak, but because you're trying to carry a weight you were never meant to bear. Generational warfare thrives in this exhaustion. It thrives when people continue to fight without knowing what they're really fighting against. It feeds on your efforts to solve what only God can resolve. Psalm 35 is a declaration that God does not just help you endure your battles, He steps in to win them for you. In your own life, you may have inherited these battles your parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents fought, and somehow, without realizing it, you've been fighting them too. It might be struggles with finances, health, relationships, or even fear. But this is the moment you can declare, enough. When David says in Psalm 35, "Fight against those who fight against me," he's making a stand, not in his own power, but in God's. This is a pivotal moment. You're not being asked to fight in your own strength. You're being asked to step into God's strength. And with that strength, the battles that have followed your family line are not yours anymore. They belong to God. If you've been feeling the weight of those inherited battles, it's time to recognize that you don't have to carry them any longer. You don't have to keep repeating what's been passed down. It's time for you to stand in the victory God has already secured. Psalm 17 reinforces this by giving us the assurance that God's protection actively keeps us safe in the midst of battles. You don't need to fight this alone. The moments of vulnerability you've experienced, the times you felt overwhelmed, the fears that have kept you up at night, are the very areas where God is ready to step in and do the work you can't. But the first step is relinquishing control and recognizing that the battle is not yours to win. You do not need to hold on to these fights any longer. God is waiting for you to hand them over. There are people listening right now who have felt exhausted from trying to fix everything, protect everyone, and make it all work. And it's draining. You've been carrying the weight of multiple battles, and it's time to lay it down. If you are ready to stop fighting battles that were never meant for you, if you are ready to let God step in and fight for you, then take this moment to declare it. Take a deep breath and say, "This battle is not mine. I give it to God." And as you do, you may feel a burden lift, not because the problem is gone, but because you've decided you no longer need to carry it. If you feel led, take a moment to leave a short prayer request in the comments. You don't need to explain everything, just give it a word. Release, peace, victory, or freedom. When you name it, you invite God to step in and fight it for you. You are not meant to keep fighting battles that were never yours. You are meant to walk in the freedom that God has already provided. What once seemed like a never-ending struggle is being handed over to the one who never loses. Psalm 35 assures us that God will fight for you. Psalm 17 assures us that God will protect you. And today, you are stepping into the reality that you don't need to fight this fight on your own anymore. God is stepping in. Hold on to this truth. The battles are being handed over to God, the weight is being lifted, and victory is already secured. You don't need to keep carrying what's not yours. It's time to let God step in. If this message spoke to you, take action now. Subscribe to Psalm 91 Warfare and become part of a living community of believers who pray, intercede, and stand together. This isn't just a channel you watch. It's a place you stay covered. Now, like this video, that simple action helps this message reach someone else who is fighting a battle in silence and needs to know they're not alone. Then go to the comments and do two things in faith. First, write your prayer request. Keep it simple if you want. Even one word is enough. When you place it there, you are inviting agreement, and this community will stand with you in prayer. Second, make this declaration boldly. God fights my battles for me and for my family. Finally, don't leave this atmosphere yet. Watch the next recommended video and stay under this covering of prayer and truth. What God started here, He wants to continue. You are not alone. You are not uncovered, and you are not fighting by yourself. Stay connected, stay prayed for, and stay right here.